So I haven't posted one of Dr. Jill Stein's Fireside chats in a very long time. And I'm posting this one because it touches on the Russiagate conspiracy that's basically taken over a large part of our political establishment and our legacy propagandist media. Now, this is not to say that great powers do not meddle in the affairs of countries, because they do. I'm sure Russia has, China has, Iran has, and especially the United States, Britain, and I can go on and on and on. But the United States tends to do so more than others. I mean, there is a list that shows all of the countries that the United States has overthrown, either militarily or using color revolutions, using NGOs, and so on and so forth. So it is the height of hypocrisy to see the phony outrage that is being propagated by our media and our politicians. Now, what's very disturbing is to see Russo American relations collapsing the way it is. And given the fact that we have thousands of nuclear weapons between Russia and the United States on hair trigger alert, this is not good. And not only should we pay attention to what's happening politically with Russiagate, we also need to pay attention to what's going on militarily as far as Russia and the United States in Syria, because that's also important as well. So I hope you guys enjoy the video. It is a little lengthy, but please watch it. Do your research on everything as always. Don't just take anything anyone says for fact. Research, and look and verify for yourselves. I don't agree with everything she says, but I think it's important to listen to everyone as far as Russiagate is concerned. I'm the Millennial Revolt. Thank you guys so much for watching, and you have a wonderful day. Bye.
Hello, Facebook friends, citizens of America and the planet. Welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat. Apologies for the delay. My Wi-Fi was not working for some odd, strange reason, but it's not the first time that we've, shall we say, run into obstacles in being heard. And we're not going to be stopped. So here we go. Thank you for joining. I hope you've seen the video of my interview on MSNBC, and I'm very grateful actually to Alex Witt for having me on, because it sort of goes against the grain of MSNBC to have the kind of discussion that we had, and I'm actually very grateful to her for enabling us to do that. And we did broach some new territory, and tonight what I'd like to do is dive right into our discussion, a reality check on Russiagate, because there's a lot going on Russiagate, a lot of developments last week we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what's true, what's maybe not so true, and how we can actually defend our elections without censoring our social media or traditional media or anything else, and without going to war and without beating the drums for war. So a really critical and important discussion. And in the interests of preventing censorship and overcoming censorship, I want to ask you if you would please share this conversation, because as you know, the censorship is in full swing now on social media, and the algorithms have been shifted, and sites like ours and conversations like this are being seriously silenced and constrained and not shared by the big internet giants. So we got to do that sharing ourselves. So thank you for getting the word out. As you know, the Russiagate discussion has kind of hit a fevered pitch over the last week. there were two really important developments. So the first was that the chiefs of the intelligence agencies came before the Senate Intelligence Committee. You may have seen footage of that, where they basically testified that Russia is still at it, in so many words, that the disinformation campaign, the effort to sow discord, as was alleged during the election, is still going on. And that's really a very interesting contention that we're going to come back to. But that was one thing. And then following on the heels of the testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee, then you had the Mueller indictment coming out for 13 Russian nationals and some Russian companies as well, for allegedly, again, interfering with social media in the election, and also with organizing some events during the course of the election. And what came out in the Mueller indictment was not really a new storyline. This had been in public circulation, public knowledge for many months. There were more details provided, but what was really new was an explanation of what was legally in violation in those efforts. What were the legal aspects of it? You may hear my puppy in the background who's clamoring to join us, so we'll see. She may beat down the door and join us before long, so just be forewarned. She's in good company, and so rest assured she's being taken good care of. So these two events took place last week, and after the Mueller indictments were released, the smears against our campaign, also against Bernie Sanders, were going strong. That our critics were making the case that, oh, this proves that we were on the take, that we were benefiting from Russia, that we were sort of Russian dupes. And I just want to stress, we'll talk about why that is not valid in a moment, but just right off the bat, I want to stress that I was mentioned in the indictment, not in any adverse way, not in any way that was placing blame, but simply to mention that one Facebook post was noted that addressed our campaign, something that was favorable to our campaign, making the point that it was a vote for peace or something like that, or that we represented the cause of peace. Not any kind of heavy-duty advertising or anything that would really make you shocked. One, okay? One. And remember, there are trillions of postings on Facebook every year. So it's really quite preposterous to try to make the case on the basis of the Mueller indictments that we were in any substantial way, in any material way, benefited from what was addressed in the Mueller indictments, or more generally. And in fact, when the Mueller indictment was released, Rod Rosenstein, who's overseeing the Mueller investigation, the Deputy Attorney General, he made the statement basically that no one was being implicated here other than the people who were being indicted, that others were not in any way being faulted or blamed in the investigation. And he also stated that it wasn't clear from the investigation whether or not this was significant, whether it had any material impact on the election whatsoever. So I will say that Mueller and Rosenstein were actually very careful not to overstate the significance of the indictments. And basically what they did was just provide insight into what laws were violated or allegedly violated in this internet activity, in this social media activity. So, it was really kind of preposterous that the media and the Democrats really tried to make it into another smear campaign, and it really kind of fell on its face. And if you had a chance to watch the interview with MSNBC, you'll see how those arguments were rather easily rebutted. So I want to also note that as a consequence of those two events last week, the calls for censorship and for warmongering and retribution against the Russians for this terrible thing, which was now supposedly being proven by the indictments, which were really unrelated to collusion in any way. The indictments didn't even show that this was the Russian government. It was really Russian nationals and corporations. So, so this was just an incredible stretch, to say the least, really quite outrageous that it was being seized as an excuse to call for military action, or to say that this was the equivalent of a 9/11, or that this was an act of war. And there were many in government and media who have been saying that, and then who were really intensifying their effort after those two events last week. So I want to point out some serious gaps in this conversation, which really changed the perspective on Russiagate and on the larger question of election interference and how we protect our democracy. So the first point I want to stress is that interference in our elections or any country's elections is not okay. It's not all right. It's actually really an assault on democracy and on national sovereignty. And that's true whether people are interfering in our elections or other countries' elections. And that's true whether the intruder is a foreign government or a criminal network, or whether it's domestic actors. And those domestic actors are definitely in the mix here, because the evidence that we have is most powerful, actually, that the domestic actors really impacted millions of voters. So voter suppression schemes, for example, voter ID laws, or the interstate cross-check or felon disenfranchisement, those voter suppression schemes are documented as effectively blocking millions of Americans for voting. How can you say that's not interference in the election? That's election interference. Another example being the interference of the DNC, which was found basically to have colluded with Hillary Clinton's campaign and with some in the big corporate media to interfere with the election in many ways, to have suppressed Bernie Sanders, to have smeared him, to have elevated Donald Trump, and to have worked with the media to have raised up Donald Trump, and along with what they called the Pied Piper candidates who were not credible in the Republican Party, so that in theory Hillary Clinton would have an easier opponent to run against. So those are certainly domestic actors that were interfering with the elections. Big media is another one, because we know that Donald Trump received at least $6 billion in free primetime TV, where you don't have trillions of competing channels. You have a few competing channels, but not many. So $6 billion worth of free primetime TV is extremely powerful, and a huge investment on the part of big corporate media that was doing what? They were essentially boosting their bottom line. This was a statement, actually, of the CEO of CBS, Les Moonves, who said, in fact, when on an open microphone that he didn't know was open, that Donald Trump was sure bad for America, but damn good. That was his words. Donald Trump was damn good for their bottom line, that is, for the big TV networks, because he attracted all that advertising and so on, because he was so outrageous and controversial and just brought in a lot of eyeballs. So is that not interference, that the selections were made for TV coverage based on an outrageous conflict of interest, basically boosting the TV network's bottom line? So the point here is that there are many sources of interference in our elections, and they should all be addressed. That's not to say that there was not Russian interference. I think one can only assume that that there was, because this is what great powers do. And we have certainly been the leader of the pack on that score, and we'll come to that in a moment. But the point is, there are many sources of interference. They should all be addressed. And to recognize that there are domestic sources of interference doesn't diminish the other ones. It just says that the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. If the objective here is to protect our democracy and to protect our elections and our national sovereignty and all that, we need protection on all of those counts so that we truly have election integrity. That's why we launched a recount after the election to find out whether or not there was tampering with the election machines, with the software, and with the whole process whereby our votes are recorded, are tallied, are reported, and so on. It's a very vulnerable process, and those recount efforts, by the way, are still in force. We have ongoing administrative and legal efforts right now, which are very close to bearing some fruit in an exciting way. We'll talk about that another time. But the point is that all of these sources of interference count, and they can all be prevented and worked on, even though you haven't identified all of the intruders. So we can post, actually, so as not to take a lot of time, we can post what the solutions are for each of those problems. It includes the likes of free airtime to qualified candidates, ballot access requirements that are equitable and open instead of this very rigged game that we play right now. It includes getting big money out of politics, opening up our debates so that the American people can actually hear who their choices are and have a full right not only to vote, but a right to know who you can vote for. A right to vote without fear. We should be able to vote with ranked choice voting, which gets rid of this fear campaign, which is also a form of voter suppression that tells you that you cannot vote for the candidate you're for and forces you, intimidates you, extorts you to voting against the candidate that you hate the most. We should be able to lead with our values and our vision. All of these problems are readily fixable, and this is within our reach. And it's, all of these problems could be corrected and should be corrected. Let me move to a second missing issue in this discussion of Russiagate. So the first one being that there are many forms of interference and that they all have to be addressed. The second point here, and that's not to diminish whatever interference Russia may have done. And again, I personally assume that those who are capable of it are interfering in the same way that we are. Russia, in my mind, undoubtedly did. But the question is how much, and did that really matter? And, I think we're still in the process of finding out. Let me just comment here as an aside. This is not a Trump talking point. The reason it's not a Trump talking point is that this does not in any way undermine the importance of the Mueller investigation, which in my view is very important. The Mueller investigation is broad. The indictments of Russia are Russian nationals are a very small part of from what we know so far, of the Mueller indictments, and they do seem to be moving towards the financial crimes committed by Trump, the Trump family, and safeguarded perhaps by the Trump campaign. There's a complex story which the Mueller campaign is pursuing. So this discussion here about the breadth of Russiagate and the breadth of election interference and election protection, this is not a Trump talking point. So for those who want to dismiss this discussion as that, just stop right now, because there's no basis for saying that. The Mueller Commission is carrying on. They are on track, and there's little doubt that Donald Trump is mired in shall we say, impeachable offenses, which we won't take time to talk about right now. But odds are the Mueller investigations are going to address that, and most likely not from collusion to interfere with the election. There may well be collusion around financial crimes. So the second really critical area of discussion here is meddling. Meddling is not just a one-way street. We're not just a victim of Russian meddling, if at all. We are by far the world's #1 meddler in other countries' elections. This is well documented in a database that ought to be front and center in the discussion of corporate media. There's a very compelling academic database that has been developed over the last couple decades at Carnegie Mellon University. You can Google it. We can also post it to the Facebook page here. But it documents exactly who has been interfering with whose elections. And between the end of the Second World War and the year 2000, the U.S. and Russia alone, just the two of us, meddled in about 117 elections. The U.S. interfered in about twice as many as Russia. So we shouldn't be blaming Russia here. We're kind of, we more than outshine Russia. We're #1, okay, in election meddling. So take a look at that database if you have any doubts. That does not include the military interventions in order to prevent elections from taking place altogether, whether it was a coup or a regime change. We have a track record there as well, and that's not even a part of this database. So suffice it to say, this is not that Russiagate should by no means be used as an excuse to call for military intervention or sanctions, because we're doing it too. And what's really shocking, in the last couple days, there have been a couple of discussions captured on media live between some noted media people and the likes of James Woolsey, who was caught on camera with Laura Ingraham. She happened to ask him, "So we don't do this, do we?" To which he said, "Well, and then he sort of fell apart and sort of mumbled gibberish, and they both just giggled because he had to say, "Yes, we do this." And she said, "Well, we're not still doing this, are we?" To which he had to say, "Well, yes, we're kind of still doing this." So, it's like this is American exceptionalism on steroids. It really doesn't fly, and this is not how we create an America based on an America and a world, I should say, based on international law and justice. If we want this to be just who's got the biggest gun, that's not going to be a great world to live in, because a lot of people now have nuclear weapons. So we need a world that's going to work based on justice, based on law, based on human rights, and based on diplomacy. So just to add another fact here to this, to the case that we do it too, in 1996, we didn't just interfere in Russia's election, we completely did a turnaround election for Boris Yeltsin, who was running for re-election. He was running about 6% in the polls. A U.S. team of advisors went in to basically help him rehabilitate his campaign. They took up residence secretly in some, Russian government hotel or some Moscow hotel, and advised him on how to, how to run a campaign. And he won. They achieved a complete turnaround. And the irony is, because Boris Yeltsin was restored to the presidency by us, he was able to further concentrate power and further create the authoritarian state that Russia is today. He handpicked his successor, who was none other than Vladimir Putin, and turned that power over to Vladimir Putin. So it is, shall we say, a somewhat ironic consequence of U.S. meddling that, in fact, Vladimir Putin is in power with the authoritarian powers that he has today as a direct result of U.S. meddling in the 1996 Russian election. So the meddling that we are, and I shouldn't say we, the meddling that the establishment and both parties has accused Russia of should not be a basis for war, for sanctions, or for censorship. Let me say briefly now just that the social media interference that's described in Mueller's indictment is a terrible thing, but number one, it appears to be very small in terms of what's contained in that actual indictment. And the broader numbers that have been provided by YouTube, by Google, by Facebook, by Twitter, they seem like they're large numbers, but when you compare them to the actual numbers on social media, they're tiny. They are a drop in the ocean. So the case has by no means been made that there was effective or meaningful intervention, that minds were changed, that this actually had an impact. So just stating that for the record. And then it should also be pointed out that what we know about the interference and the social media campaign is that it was not a strategic electoral campaign. The states that were predominantly targeted were what? New York and Texas, not swing states. If this was a political campaign, they would have been monitoring the polls and directing their efforts where they would have made a difference. That was not done at all. If you look at Wisconsin, a swing state, the predominant effort made by this internet research agency, the company that was directing this social media campaign, they directed their efforts in Wisconsin largely to the primary, not in the general, almost none to the general whatsoever. So it really doesn't look like this was much of a political campaign. So in a previous New York Times article on this internet research agency, this Russian company directing the campaign, they actually described it as a trolls for hire operation. And as some investigative reporters and observers have noted, there's very little to support that they were actually a political campaign. It may in fact make a whole lot more sense that they were basically a clickbait marketing operation whose goals were to attract eyeballs that they could then sell to their advertisers. And let me just move Willie here so he's not messing with our papers. So, the whole argument that this was some kind of a sophisticated, Kremlin-directed, Russian government-sponsored media effort has yet to be really established. And I just want to raise those questions. We'll come back to this another time. But suffice it to say that the case has not been overwhelmingly been made here. I want to raise an issue here that I'm also going to just touch on briefly about the organization that's been coming up with this analysis and pushing this conclusion that this was a sophisticated government media operation. This is a group called Hamilton 68, which is basically, shall we say, they've been coming up with untested assumptions from an unproven and rather dubious source. Hamilton 68, they describe their purpose as quashing information rebellions. If that doesn't sound like a setup for censorship, I don't know what does. Their founder, named Clint Watts, is a former military propagandist. By his own admission, he helped squander billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars in the Middle East trying in a propaganda campaign, a failed propaganda campaign, basically that was trying to improve the image and the public opinion about the U.S. military in the Middle East. Now, it's not so easy to do that for some very good reasons, and they failed miserably. And by his own admission, this is his background, essentially as a propagandist squandering U.S. taxpayer dollars. He also has his roots in an extremist right-wing organization founded by Austrian fascists, in fact, an organization called the Foreign Policy Research Institute, described by a journalist, Mark Ames, as, quote, one of the looniest extreme right think tanks since the early Cold War days, promoting winnable nuclear war, maximum confrontation, and attacking anti-colonialism as dangerously unworkable. So not exactly an agenda that lends itself to foreign policy advice or even analysis on some very important and sensitive issues. It's interesting. The parent institute for Hamilton 66 is this Alliance for Securing Democracy, described by The Intercept as an apparently well-funded national security advocacy group that brings together neoliberal Democrats with some of the most extreme and discredited neocons, devoted to creating more hawkish policies for the United States, particularly towards Russia. Its board of advisors includes advisors like Mike Morell, Obama's acting CIA director, Mike Chertoff, who was Bush's Homeland Security Secretary, and noted neocon Bill Kristol. So this is what's at the roots of this single organization that's coming up with these analyses from which the whole social media hysteria is being generated. Another thing about Hamilton 68 is that they won't disclose where their analysis is coming from. Their analysis is based on 600 Twitter accounts, which they say are basically tools of Russia, which are conducting this disinformation campaign, this propaganda campaign. But they won't disclose who those accounts are. And on their website, if you look at, so who are these? Who are these people that Hamilton 68 is actually analyzing? They say that they are Twitter accounts that are, quote, in step with material from well-known Russia propaganda outlets, in other words, RT. So groups that are in step with RT, maybe like Black Lives Matter, or shall we say with themes from RT, in step with themes from RT like Black Lives Matter, Wall Street greed, anti-fracking protests, gun control, peace movement, etc. Their website also says that these Twitter accounts belong to people, quote, who may not understand themselves to be part of a pro-Russian social network, unquote. Okay? So on one hand, they're saying that this is a Russian, a Russian army of bots and trolls. But then if you look at the fine print, it's actually Twitter accounts who may not, in fact, know themselves to be part of a Russian network in any way. Hamilton 68 also says that these accounts may be, quote, unconnected to the Russian government, but they amplify themes that are being promoted by Russian government media, themes promoted by RT, which are themes like Occupy Wall Street greed, gun control, anti-fracking protests, etc. I don't watch RT myself, so I don't know what RT's agenda is, but I will say there are some great programs on RT that I do watch, whose agenda is exactly those things. So is that what they're referring to? Material that the progressive community would also be promoting? Is that what's being hooked up here in the eyes of Hamilton 68? Why won't they tell us who they're analyzing? That's extremely, shall we say, suspicious. Hamilton 68 won't disclose their accounts because, here's what they say on their website: our metrics are not 100% accurate. Okay. How inaccurate are they? That's what we need to know. They say some of the accounts in our list that we're analyzing may actually not be relevant. But we don't want to publicly attribute even one specific account incorrectly. So they're saying that they're not going to come forward with who they're analyzing because they don't want to unjustly smear or tarnish the reputation of any of these accounts. On the other hand, they have no qualms about leading us towards sanctions, towards war, and towards censorship on the basis of incorrect data. So it speaks volumes about the need to really call out Hamilton 68 as some kind of a shady deal that needs to come clean and get honest about about what their analysis is actually based on. So I think you get the point here that there's some odd stuff going on. On the basis of the Hamilton 68 pronouncements, the intelligence agencies testified before the Senate that Russia is still at it. And that was, their words. And that's what's been propagated by the warmongering media. Russia is still at it. Well, what was it that Hamilton 68 came up with? They came up with that the meme, hashtag release the memo, was the product of Russian intervention, that it was the Russian bots that jumped on it, that pushed it in order to undermine the Mueller investigation. So Hamilton 68 is blaming the trending of that release the memo on Russia. And they're also saying, and if the Twitter sites that they were looking at are not actually part of a Russian network, then that's not okay. That's not okay for them to be providing false data, which is then used by the intelligence community to drive our policy in an unjustified and dangerous direction. Hamilton 68 has also just last week come up with the conclusion that the trending of the gun control hashtags was also due to Russian bots. And in fact, a New York Times headline, if I can find it here, basically said as much, that the Russian trolls, New York Times headline: after Florida school shooting, Russian bot army pounced. Well, this is presuming that Hamilton 68's analysis is based on a Russian bot army. But it may not be bots, for one thing. A small portion may be bots, but the whole thing may not be bots. And, we deserve to know what portion is bots, what is not, what portion is actually Russian, and what portion is just other communities who happen to be tweeting about the same time, time-sensitive subjects that are also newsworthy. A lot of people tweet about newsworthy stuff, and just because they're in sync with Russia doesn't mean that they're doing that because of RT. And we deserve to know, because it's not clear. And some very powerful policy prescriptions are being set in motion by these conclusions, which again are untested assumptions, unverified assumptions, shall we say, coming from untrusted sources, namely Hamilton 68. So Russian interference should not be used as a pretext for warmongering or censorship. We need a reality check. U.S.-Russia relations are going downhill in a big way. We've got 15,000 nuclear weapons between the two of us, Thousands are on nuclear hair trigger alert. This is the most dangerous time, virtually, ever shown on the doomsday nuclear clock. So inflammatory rhetoric is not a good thing right now. Rachel Maddow and others, you don't want to be beating the war drums. Let's stand up like adults. Let's woman up here, okay? If you're capable of that. Let's woman up and let's man up and let's actually look this problem in the face and not just exercise knee-jerk exceptionalism here. Let's participate in a community of nations, and let's look internally here and let's fix these problems. We can protect our elections at the same time that we protect our civil liberties. We should not be undertaking censorship. We should be reversing the censorship that's already been laid down on social media. And let me ask you again to please share this discussion so that we can help combat that censorship. And we should not be beating war drums, and we should not be calling for sanctions on the basis of unverified assumptions by untested and untrusted organizations and sources. So we can do this. Democracy's in the target here. It's time to stand up and protect our elections, protect our civil liberties, protect international peace, and not allow it to deteriorate further. And fundamentally, let's protect our democracy.